You ever wonder where it all began? Not just, where did humans come from, but where did civilization come from? We're talking about the whole shebang: cities, writing, laws, kings, taxes, and maybe even a little bit of bureaucracy. It's a question that keeps a lot of historians and archaeologists up at night. And for a long time, the answer was just a black hole of prehistory. But then, in the 19th century, in a place we now call Iraq, a group of scholars and treasure hunters started digging in the dirt and pulling out clay tablets covered in strange, wedge-shaped markings. And as they slowly, painstakingly deciphered them, a picture began to emerge of a place and a people that had been completely forgotten for thousands of years. It turns out that a place you've probably heard of, the land between two rivers, Mesopotamia, was the very first address for a people we call the Sumerians. And they wrote the first chapter of human history. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you are already subscribed, thank you so much for your support. I'm curious, what time is it where you are right now? It's pretty late here, and I'm just hoping to help you drift off to sleep. The story of the Sumerians begins not with a bang, but with a slow, almost imperceptible shift in human behavior. Imagine a time around 6500 BCE, when people were still mostly living in small, scattered villages. They were farmers, sure, but they were also at the mercy of the elements. The land around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was incredibly fertile, a veritable Eden, but it was also temperamental. The rivers would flood unpredictably, sometimes drowning crops, other times leaving the land parched. It was a chaotic, beautiful, and dangerous place. But something began to change. Instead of just surviving, these early inhabitants started to adapt. They began to build small channels, dikes, and reservoirs to control the water. They figured out how to direct the flow, to bring water to their fields when they needed it, and to protect their homes when the rivers swelled. It was the birth of large-scale irrigation, and it was a game changer. It allowed for a surplus of food, which meant not everyone had to be a farmer. Some people could specialize. They could be potters, weavers, or masons. The villages grew, slowly at first, and then with an astonishing speed. Archaeologists and historians still argue whether these early people were the direct ancestors of the Sumerians, or if the Sumerians were a later group that migrated in. The origin of the Sumerian people is one of the biggest mysteries of this entire civilization. Their language, which we'll get to later, isn't related to any other known language on Earth. It's a linguistic isolate, a kind of ancient puzzle box that has yet to be fully solved. It's as if they just appeared. They didn't come from the mountains to the north or the deserts to the south. They just coalesced in this small, fertile crescent. We don't have a record of them conquering the land or migrating in great hordes. They are simply there, building their cities and taming the rivers. And what they did in that land, in those cities, was unlike anything the world had ever seen before. As the small villages grew, they didn't just become bigger villages. They became something entirely new: cities. The first true city, so far as we can tell, was a place called Uruk. Uruk wasn't just a collection of huts. It was a sprawling, planned metropolis with a population that would be considered respectable even today. We're talking tens of thousands of people, maybe even 50,000 or more, all living and working together within a single urban center. To put that in perspective, the largest towns of the Stone Age were only a few hundred people at best. Uruk was on a different scale entirely. It had massive temples, monumental buildings, and a complex social structure. You had priests, rulers, scribes, artisans, and laborers, all contributing to the whole. This was the first time in human history that people were living in such close proximity, relying on each other in such an intricate web of interdependence. It was a social experiment, and it worked. And it all happened because of water. Because they learned to control the rivers, they created the conditions for an explosion of culture, technology, and social organization. It was the dawn of a new era, a time when humanity started to settle down and build something that would last. It was the birth of civilization. The city of Uruk wasn't just big. It was a living, breathing testament to what a large group of people could accomplish when they worked together. The city center was dominated by two massive temple precincts, the Eanna and the Kulaba. These weren't just places for worship. They were the economic and administrative hearts of the city, controlling vast amounts of land and wealth. The Eanna, in particular, was dedicated to the goddess Inanna, a major figure in the Sumerian pantheon, and it was a sprawling complex of courtyards, workshops, and ceremonial halls. I mean, think about it. This is before cranes, before steel, before anything we would recognize as modern construction equipment. The Sumerians built these monumental structures with mud bricks, a technique they perfected, and not just any bricks. They used a process of firing them in kilns to make them more durable. Imagine the coordination, the sheer human effort required to make and lay thousands upon thousands of bricks to build a temple complex that could house a small army of priests and administrators. The layout of Uruk was a chaotic masterpiece. Its streets were a winding maze, not the neat grid you might imagine from a planned city today. But within that chaos was a highly organized system. The temples served as the central storage depots for surplus grain and other goods. This is where the priests and temple administrators came in. They weren't just religious figures. They were the first accountants and bureaucrats. They developed a system for keeping track of all the goods coming in and going out. This wasn't just a simple tally. It was a complex system of accounting that required a new tool: writing. The earliest forms of cuneiform, which we'll dive into later, weren't for writing poetry or epic stories. They were for tracking how many bushels of barley were paid as a tithe, or how many goats were used for a sacrifice. It's the least romantic origin story for one of humanity's greatest inventions, but it's a very real one. They invented writing because they needed to do their taxes, essentially. The population density of Uruk was incredible. Historians still argue whether the population numbers are accurate. But even on the low end, it was a massive settlement. All these people needed to be fed, housed, and governed. And that required a level of social organization that was unprecedented. There was a clear hierarchy. At the top were the priests and a figure who was something like a king, the Ien or Lugal. Below them were the elite, the landowners, and the military commanders. Then you had the artisans and craftsmen, people who had specialized skills like pottery or metalworking. And at the bottom were the farmers and laborers who worked the land and did the heavy lifting for the massive construction projects. It was a stratified society, but it was also a symbiotic one. The farmers fed the city, and the city provided them with a market for their goods and protection from external threats. Uruk was also a hub for trade. Its location on the Euphrates River made it a natural center for commerce. Goods would come in from all over the ancient world. You'd see merchants from as far away as the Indus Valley, bringing in exotic materials like carnelian beads. Timber would float down the rivers from the forests to the north, and precious stones and metals would come in from the mountains to the east. The city was a melting pot of different cultures and ideas, all brought together by the irresistible pull of a thriving urban center. This wasn't just a city, it was the world's first global economic powerhouse. And it's a reminder that globalization isn't some newfangled idea. It's a tale as old as time itself, starting with people hauling stuff on donkeys and boats instead of giant cargo ships. Life in Uruk would have been a sensory overload. The smell of baking bread would have mingled with the smoke from kilns and the less pleasant aromas of a city without modern sanitation. The air would have been filled with the sounds of hammers on metal, the chatter of the marketplace, and the solemn chants from the temples. It was a place of immense human energy and activity. The very fact that they could sustain such a large population in one place was a triumph of human ingenuity and cooperation. It showed that when you solve one problem, like a food surplus, it creates a cascade of new ones, like social organization and administration, which in turn leads to even more innovation. Uruk was a puzzle box of a city, with each new discovery leading to a deeper understanding of how these people lived, worked, and thrived in a way that had never been done before. And while the city of Uruk grew and thrived, a different kind of story was being told, one that echoes down to us through the ages in a way you might not expect. The Sumerians had a deep and abiding mythology, and central to it was a tale of a great flood. It's a story we know best from the Epic of Gilgamesh, a massive narrative poem transcribed on clay tablets. The hero of that epic, Gilgamesh, is told the story of a man named Utnapishtim, a sort of Mesopotamian Noah. Utnapishtim is warned by the god Enki of a coming flood, sent by the gods to destroy humanity. He is instructed to build a giant boat and to take his family and two of every animal on board. The rain comes, the world is submerged, and after the waters recede, Utnapishtim and his family are granted immortality by the gods. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The parallels between the Sumerian flood story and the biblical one are so striking that for a long time, scholars assumed one must have been copied from the other. It's a fascinating puzzle. Did the Hebrews, during their Babylonian captivity, hear this tale and adapt it for their own religious tradition? Or is it something more profound? Some historians and geologists argue that the myth may have a basis in an actual historical event, a cataclysmic flood that occurred in the Tigris-Euphrates river valley around 2900 BCE. The rivers, particularly the Euphrates, are prone to massive, unpredictable flooding. A particularly devastating flood, or a series of them, could have wiped out entire settlements, leaving a lasting impression on the survivors. The collective trauma of such an event could have been woven into the fabric of their mythology and passed down through oral tradition for generations before it was ever written down. It's an interesting thought, isn't it? That a story we think of as purely religious or mythological might have started as a terrifying news report. The Sumerians, living on the floodplains, would have been all too aware of the raw, destructive power of nature. Their entire way of life was a struggle against the whims of the rivers. So it makes perfect sense that a flood story would be central to their worldview. It's a tale of divine anger and human helplessness, but also of divine mercy and survival. Utnapishtim, in the epic, isn't a hero because he's a great warrior. He's a hero because he listened, he obeyed, and he found a way to preserve life in the face of utter destruction. The tale reminds us that in the Sumerian world, the gods were not some abstract concept. They were active, sometimes capricious, forces that had a direct impact on daily life. The gods were a very big deal to the Sumerians. Their entire society was built around them. The city wasn't just a collection of people. It was the house of a particular god or goddess. Uruk, as we know, was the domain of Inanna. The people of the city were, in effect, her servants. The priests and priestesses were the intermediaries between the human world and the divine. The ziggurats, those massive stepped pyramids that would later become a hallmark of Mesopotamian architecture, were literal stairways to heaven, built to provide a home on earth for their deities. They were more than just temples. They were cosmic link-ups. The very act of building and maintaining them was a form of worship, a way of keeping the gods happy and ensuring the continued prosperity of the city. In a world where natural disasters were a constant threat, and the line between survival and annihilation was razor thin, it's no wonder that the Sumerians poured so much of their energy and resources into placating the gods. The flood story, and other myths like it, were not just entertainment. They were morality tales, cautionary fables, and a way to explain the unexplainable. They taught people that the gods were powerful, easily angered, but could also be appeased. They provided a sense of order in a chaotic world, a way to understand why bad things happened, and what you could do, or what a hero could do, to make them right. And to honor those capricious gods, the Sumerians built things, big things, the kind of things that would make you crane your neck and say, "Whoa." These were the ziggurats, those massive step towers that rose from the heart of every major Sumerian city. They weren't like the pyramids of Egypt, which were tombs for kings. Ziggurats were something else entirely. They were artificial mountains built of mud brick, and they were the most important structures in Sumerian society. At the very top, there was a small temple, a holy of holies, where the priests would conduct rituals and where, it was believed, the city's patron god or goddess would descend to commune with humanity. The act of building a ziggurat was a monumental undertaking. It required a huge amount of labor and resources, but the Sumerians saw it as a necessary act of piety. They were literally building a home for their gods on earth. The ziggurat was a symbol of the city's wealth, power, and devotion. It was also a very practical thing to have. It was a place of safety during the frequent floods, and the large courtyards at the base could be used for markets and public gatherings. The whole structure was a blend of the sacred and the profane, a place where business, religion, and community all came together. Historians still argue whether the ziggurat was a purely Sumerian invention or if it evolved from earlier temple platforms. Whatever the case, by the time of the third dynasty of Ur, the ziggurat had reached its zenith, a multi-story, terraced structure that dominated the skyline. Imagine standing in the bustling marketplace of ancient Ur, surrounded by the clamor of merchants and the smell of freshly baked bread, and looking up at this enormous, awe-inspiring structure with its terraced sides and a temple shining at the very top. It would have been a constant reminder of the gods' presence in their daily lives, a beacon of order in a world that could be chaotic and unpredictable. The Sumerian pantheon was a crowded one, a whole cosmic family drama playing out in the heavens. At the top was An, the sky god, who was more of a distant, hands-off deity. More involved were gods like Enlil, the god of air, wind, and storms, and Enki, the god of water, wisdom, and magic. And then there was Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and fertility, who was particularly important in Uruk. The gods were not omnipotent or all-knowing. They had flaws. They fought with each other. They fell in love, and they got angry. In this way, they were a lot like humans, just with way more power. The Sumerians didn't worship these gods blindly. They had a transactional relationship with them. They offered sacrifices and built temples to keep the gods happy. And in return, they hoped for good harvests, victory in war, and a long life. This cosmic order was central to their identity. The Sumerians saw the world as a creation of the gods, and they saw themselves as the gods' servants, put on earth to do their bidding, and to keep the universe running smoothly. This worldview extended to every aspect of their lives, from their laws to their literature. The laws, for instance, were often presented as being handed down by the gods, which gave them a divine authority that no human king could question. It was a brilliant way to ensure social stability. If you broke the law, you weren't just breaking a human rule. You were offending the gods themselves. It was the original "don't mess with me" argument, and it worked pretty well for a few thousand years. The ziggurats and the rich mythology were more than just historical curiosities. They were the very foundations of Sumerian society. They were the architectural and ideological glue that held a complex urban civilization together. They were the physical manifestation of their belief system, a tangible link between the mud of the earth and the heavens they so revered. They were a testament to the fact that for the Sumerians, the gods weren't just a concept. They were their neighbors, living right there in the temple on top of the big brick mountain. Now, imagine a problem. You have a massive urban center with thousands of people, and goods are moving everywhere. How do you keep track of all that? How do you know how much grain you've stored, or how many jars of oil have been given to the temple? For a while, they used tokens, little clay shapes that represented a sheep or a bushel of barley. You'd put them in a clay envelope, and it was a simple, tangible way to keep a record. But it was clumsy and inefficient. What if you had 100 sheep? You'd need 100 tokens, and that's just for one transaction. They needed a better way. And in that moment, a group of scribes, those first temple bureaucrats, had a eureka moment that changed the world forever. They realized they didn't need the tokens. They could just draw a picture of the token on the outside of the envelope. And then they realized they didn't even need the envelope. They could just draw the pictures on a flat piece of clay. And from there, the pictures became symbols, and the symbols became the world's first writing system. Cuneiform. The word cuneiform comes from the Latin word cuneus, which means wedge. And if you look at a cuneiform tablet, you can see why. The symbols are made up of little wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay with a reed stylus. The beauty of this system was its flexibility. It started as a system of pictograms, simple drawings of objects. A picture of an ox head meant an ox. A picture of a head with a bowl meant to eat. It was a good start, but it had its limits. How do you represent an abstract concept like love or fear? The Sumerians, in their brilliant practicality, figured it out. They started using the symbols to represent sounds, not just objects. For example, and the symbol for arrow in Sumerian was T. The word for life was also T. So they could use the arrow symbol to represent the sound T in any word, even if it had nothing to do with arrows. This was a massive cognitive leap, a move from a system of pictures to a system of phonetics. It was the birth of true writing. The invention of cuneiform wasn't a one-day thing. It was a slow, deliberate evolution over centuries. The earliest examples, from around 3200 BCE, are incredibly simple, mostly lists and administrative records. But as the system matured, it became more and more sophisticated. The symbols became more abstract, losing their resemblance to the original objects. A simple line, drawing of a head, became a series of a few wedges. A drawing of a hand became a different series of wedges. It's a bit like watching a modern emoji become more and more abstract until you can't even remember what the original drawing looked like. The scribes, the masters of this complex system, became an incredibly important class in Sumerian society. They were the keepers of knowledge, the writers of laws, and the chroniclers of history. They were the original nerds, and they ran the world. The cuneiform tablets we have today give us an unparalleled window into the Sumerian mind. We have everything from administrative records to epic poems, from school lessons to personal letters. We know what their legal codes looked like, what their myths were, and even what their students complained about. Turns out, they hated homework just as much as we do. One of the most fascinating aspects of cuneiform is that it was adopted by so many other cultures. The Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and many others all used cuneiform to write their own languages. It was the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, the ancient world's version of a universal USB cable that could plug into any language. The development of writing had a profound impact on Sumerian society. It allowed for the creation of standardized laws, complex trade contracts, and detailed historical records. It was the first time that knowledge could be stored and transmitted with perfect accuracy across generations. Without cuneiform, we would know almost nothing about the Sumerians. Their cities would just be mounds of dirt and mud brick. But because they took the time to press those little wedges into clay, their voices echoed down to us today. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the simplest of innovations can have the biggest impact, turning a temporary record into an eternal legacy. While the scribes were busy inventing writing, the city of Uruk wasn't just sitting still. It was a place of great mythological heroes. and none was more famous than Gilgamesh, a name we'll get to in a bit. But before him, there was another hero king, a figure who straddles the line between history and legend, Lugalbanda. In the Sumerian king list, he's named as the second king of the first dynasty of Uruk, following his brother Enmerkar. But in the mythological narratives, he is a much more complex figure, a hero who embarks on incredible journeys and serves as a direct link between the gods and the kings who came after him. The stories of Lugalbanda are preserved in two major epic poems, Lugalbanda in the Mountain Cave and Lugalbanda and the Anzud Bird. In the first, Lugalbanda is a soldier on an expedition with his army. He falls ill in a mountain cave and is left behind by his comrades, who believe he's going to die. But through the help of the gods, he miraculously recovers and begins a solo journey back to Uruk. It's a classic hero's journey, a story of an individual overcoming immense odds. He's not just a king, he's a survivor, a man of incredible resilience. The story is a fascinating look at the Sumerian ideal of a hero, someone who is not only a great warrior, but also deeply pious and favored by the gods. He makes offerings to the gods, and in return, they give him the strength and guidance he needs to make it home. The second epic, Lugalbanda and the Anzud Bird, is a bit more whimsical and fantastical. In this tale, Lugalbanda helps a mythical giant bird named Anzud, a kind of lion-headed eagle, with its chick. In return for his kindness, the bird grants him incredible speed and endurance. This gift is what allows him to travel vast distances to help his king, his brother Enmerkar, who is at war with the city of Arata. The Anzud bird is a powerful mythological creature, a symbol of divine power, and Lugalbanda's relationship with it shows his special status. He's not just a king who rules by force. He's a king who has a direct line to the divine. He's a bridge between the mortal and immortal worlds, a figure of incredible spiritual authority. Historians still argue whether Lugalbanda was a real historical figure. The Sumerian king list, while a fascinating document, mixes historical kings with mythical ones, so it's hard to separate fact from fiction. But what's more important than his historical reality is his symbolic role. He's a model for the ideal king. He's brave, pious, and wise, and he has a special connection to the gods. He's also the father of Gilgamesh, a fact that ties him directly to the most famous hero in all of Sumerian literature. By making the hero of the Great Flood epic the son of this semi-divine, epic hero, the Sumerians were creating a kind of heroic lineage. They were saying, these aren't just kings. These are the sons of gods and heroes, men who have a special destiny. The stories of Lugalbanda were a way for the Sumerians to explore their own values. They valued resilience, piety, and wisdom. They believed that a king's legitimacy came not just from his ability to lead an army, but from his favor with the gods. Lugalbanda's tales were part of a long-standing tradition of oral storytelling that was eventually written down on clay tablets. They were probably told and retold around campfires and in the bustling courtyards of the temples for centuries before they were ever committed to cuneiform. They were part of the very air the Sumerians breathed, a shared cultural heritage that bound them together as a people. And so, Lugalbanda, whether he was a real person or not, lives on as a symbol of the ideal king and the original hero's journey. He is the link between the mythological past and the historical present, the father of the world's first great epic hero. He's the first chapter in a heroic lineage that would culminate in the story of his son, Gilgamesh, a story that would go on to explore themes that are still relevant to us today, like friendship, loss, and the eternal human quest for meaning. And so we come to Gilgamesh, the hero of the world's first great epic poem, and according to the Sumerian king list, the fifth king of Uruk. But don't think of him as some boring historical figure. The Gilgamesh of the epic is a larger-than-life character, a king who is two-thirds god and one-third man, a being of immense strength and unparalleled arrogance. He's a tyrant at the beginning of the story, using his power to sleep with every bride on her wedding night and to exhaust his people with endless building projects. The people of Uruk, in their desperation, cry out to the gods for help. The gods hear them, and in response, they create Gilgamesh's equal, a wild man named Enkidu, to challenge and tame him. Enkidu is the foil to Gilgamesh. He lives among the animals in the wilderness, untouched by civilization. He's a pure, innocent, and natural force. A hunter discovers him, and with the help of a temple harlot, brings him into the city. Enkidu and Gilgamesh meet in a great wrestling match, a clash of two forces of nature. Gilgamesh wins, but the struggle is so epic that a mutual respect and admiration are born. They become the best of friends, a perfect duo of civilized power and untamed wildness. Their friendship is the beating heart of the epic, a testament to the power of human connection. The story of their bond is, in some ways, more powerful and enduring than the tales of their heroic exploits. With Enkidu as his moral compass, Gilgamesh's reckless energy is channeled into adventure. The two friends embark on a series of quests. First, they journey to the cedar forest to slay the monster Humbaba, the forest's guardian appointed by the god Enlil. This is a classic hero's quest, a tale of bravery and skill, and they succeed, but they also incur the wrath of the gods. Then they return to Uruk, and the goddess Inanna herself, in a moment of hubris, offers to marry Gilgamesh. He scoffs at her, listing all the ways she has tormented her past lovers. Enraged, she sends the bull of heaven to destroy Uruk. Gilgamesh and Enkidu, together, kill the bull. It's a moment of glorious victory, but it is also their downfall. For defying the gods, one of them must die. The gods decide to take Enkidu, Gilgamesh's dear friend. The death of Enkidu shatters Gilgamesh. He grieves with a raw, visceral agony. He wanders the wilderness, a broken man, covered in animal skins, lamenting the loss of his friend, and, for the first time, confronting his own mortality. He sees a future where he too will turn to dust, a fate he cannot bear. His quest for immortality begins. He seeks out Utnapishtim, the hero of the Great Flood, the one man who was granted eternal life by the gods. He journeys to the ends of the earth, through a dark tunnel in the mountains, across the waters of death, to find him. When he finally arrives, Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood and offers him a test. Stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. Gilgamesh fails almost immediately, a poignant reminder that he is, in the end, still a man. Utnapishtim, in a moment of mercy, tells Gilgamesh of a plant that restores youth, which lies at the bottom of the sea. Gilgamesh dives down and finds it, but on his journey back, A snake eats the plant and sheds its skin, gaining a new life. It's a final, heartbreaking defeat. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, not with immortality, but with a profound acceptance of his fate. He realizes that his immortality is not in living forever, but in the great works he built and the stories that will be told about him. The epic ends with Gilgamesh marveling at the great walls of Uruk, his legacy. The poem, written on 12 clay tablets, is more than just a heroic tale. It's a meditation on life, death, friendship, and the meaning of legacy. It's a story that transcends time, a beautiful, tragic, and deeply human epic that gave us a window into the soul of the Sumerians. It is, perhaps, the greatest gift they ever gave to the world. From the monumental legends of Gilgamesh, we descend into the very earth to uncover a more tangible, and in some ways more haunting, testament to the wealth and beliefs of the Sumerians, the royal tombs of Ur. In the 1920s, a British archaeologist named Sir Leonard Woolley began excavating the ancient city of Ur, a city that had rivaled Uruk in its heyday. He was looking for the historical roots of the biblical city of Abraham. But what he found was something far more astonishing. Beneath a layer of flood debris, he discovered a series of 16 tombs rich with gold, lapis lazuli, and other precious materials. The most famous was the tomb of a woman named Buabi, whose royal seal identified her as a queen or priestess. The tomb of Buabi was a treasure trove filled with exquisite artifacts. She was buried wearing an elaborate headdress of gold leaves, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, along with a pair of huge gold earrings and necklaces. Next to her lay a magnificent lyre, its soundbox decorated with a bull's head made of gold and lapis. The craftsmanship was so sophisticated that it defied the notion of a primitive early civilization. These weren't just simple trinkets, they were works of art, the product of master craftsmen who had honed their skills over centuries. They show a society with a highly developed sense of aesthetics and a vast network of trade routes to acquire such materials. Lapis lazuli, for example, had to be imported all the way from modern-day Afghanistan, a testament to the wide reach of the Sumerian trade empire. But the most shocking discovery at the royal tombs was not the treasure. It was what Woolley called the death pits. In the trenches leading to the main tombs, he found the remains of dozens of people, all arranged in neat rows. Soldiers, musicians, and servants, all dressed in their finest clothes, lay together. A group of female attendants were found near Puabi, wearing similar elaborate headdresses. At first, Woolley assumed they were sacrificed. The evidence was strong. They were not buried in a state of struggle. They were laid out as if in a ceremonial procession. A small, elegant cup was found near each body, leading to the theory that they had willingly consumed poison to join their lord or lady in the afterlife. It was a practice of human sacrifice on a scale that was almost unbelievable. The practice of human sacrifice, if that's what it was, has been the subject of intense scholarly debate. Historians and archaeologists still argue whether these people went willingly to their deaths. The lack of a struggle suggests they might have. But the thought of a society that would require dozens of people to be buried with their ruler is unsettling. It speaks to a deep-seated belief in the afterlife and a social structure where the life of the ruler was so important that it demanded the lives of others to serve them in the next world. It's a sobering contrast to the heroic narratives and the bureaucratic efficiency we've seen so far. It shows us a darker side of this brilliant civilization, a side where life was cheap and death was an elaborate, terrifying ritual. The finds at the royal tombs of Ur give us a unique look at Sumerian beliefs about the afterlife. They believed that the soul descended to a dark, shadowy underworld, and that a person's status in the afterlife was determined by their earthly wealth. The more you were buried with, the better off you would be. For the rulers of Ur, this meant taking their entire retinue with them, a macabre procession into the great unknown. The artifacts from the tombs are not just beautiful objects, they are a snapshot of a worldview, a society that believed in the continuity of life after death, and a ruler's need for their attendance in the next world. The royal tombs of Ur are a silent, golden testament to the power of belief, and a stark, somber reminder of a practice that has long since faded into the dark corners of history. The Sumerians were a brilliant people, but they were also a divided one. Their civilization was a collection of independent city-states, each with its own king, its own god, and its own interests. They traded with each other, they fought with each other, and they were always jockeying for power. For centuries, no one city-state could truly dominate the others. That is, until the rise of Sargon of Akkad. Sargon wasn't Sumerian. He was an Akkadian, a Semitic-speaking person from the northern part of Mesopotamia. His story is one of the most dramatic in all of ancient history, a classic rags to riches tale that would inspire later conquerors. According to legend, he was a foundling set adrift in a basket on the Euphrates River, much like the later story of Moses. He was discovered by a gardener and rose through the ranks of the king of Kish, where he served as a cupbearer. But he had grander ambitions. Sargon, with a genius for military strategy and a ruthlessness that would be a hallmark of future empire builders, overthrew the king of Kish and began his campaign of conquest. He marched south, conquering one Sumerian city-state after another, from Ur to Uruk to Lagash. He didn't just conquer them, he unified them under a single rule. He created the world's first true empire, a territory that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. His capital was the city of Akkad, a city whose location is still a mystery to archaeologists, a kind of lost city of gold that we know existed but can't find. This empire, the Akkadian Empire, marked a massive shift in Mesopotamian history. The era of the independent Sumerian city-state was over, at least for a time. Sargon's rule was a time of unprecedented peace and prosperity. Though it was a peace enforced by military might, he established a professional army, a standing force that was loyal to him alone. A new concept in a world of temporary militias. He standardized weights and measures, which made trade easier across his vast empire. He also installed his daughter, Enheduanna, as the high priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur. This was a brilliant political move. It gave him control over the powerful temple institutions in the Sumerian south and created a religious link between the Sumerian and Akkadian peoples. Enheduanna was a remarkable figure in her own right, a poet and priestess whose works are the first to be attributed to a specific author in history. She wrote hymns to the goddess Inanna, a testament to the cultural blending that was happening under Akkadian rule. The Akkadians absorbed a lot from the Sumerians, but they also brought their own culture and language. While Sumerian continued to be the language of the temples and scribal schools, Akkadian became the language of administration and everyday life. The wedge-shaped cuneiform script, which the Sumerians had invented, was adapted to write the Akkadian language. This shows the incredible utility and power of the Sumerian invention. It was so good that even their conquerors adopted it. This blending of cultures is one of the most fascinating aspects of Sargon's reign. It wasn't a total cultural wipeout, it was a synthesis, a new hybrid civilization that was both Sumerian and Akkadian. Sargon's legacy was immense. He showed that it was possible to rule a vast and diverse territory with a single administration. He created a model for empire that would be followed by later civilizations for thousands of years. But his empire, like all things, was not eternal. It would last for a little over a century, a testament to his sheer force of will and the brilliance of his vision. After his death, his descendants would struggle to hold the empire together. But for a time, Sargon united the Fertile Crescent under a single, powerful hand, bringing an end to the era of independent city-states and ushering in the age of empires. The Sumerians, who had created the first cities, were now part of the First Empire, a change that would fundamentally alter the course of their history forever. With Sargon's conquest, the Sumerians found themselves part of something much bigger than their individual city-states. It was a time of immense cultural exchange and synthesis. While the Akkadian Empire was a political reality, the Sumerian culture was so deeply ingrained that it didn't just disappear. Instead, it was adopted, adapted, and elevated by the new rulers. The Akkadians, who had originally used a simple script, quickly saw the value of the sophisticated Sumerian cuneiform and modified it to write their own Semitic language. This was more than just a convenience. It was a testament to the power of the Sumerian invention. The wedge-shaped marks became the vehicle for a new literary tradition, one that would give us the Epic of Gilgamesh in its final, most famous form. The blend was everywhere. Akkadian gods were given Sumerian attributes, and Sumerian gods were given Akkadian names. The goddess Inanna, for instance, was equated with the Akkadian goddess Ishtar. Enheduanna, remember Sargon's daughter, the priestess. She wrote her hymns to Inanna, but she also wrote them with a new kind of literary flair, blending Sumerian and Akkadian themes. Her work stands as a beautiful example of this cultural fusion. She was a bridge between the two worlds, and her legacy is a reminder that even in a time of political conquest, culture finds a way to endure and evolve. The Akkadian administration was a marvel of its time. Sargon and his successors established a centralized government with governors reporting directly to the king. They levied taxes, maintained an army, and oversaw large-scale public works projects. This was a departure from the more decentralized model of the Sumerian city-states. The bureaucracy we saw emerging in Uruk was now on a massive imperial scale. This centralized control, while perhaps unpopular with the old Sumerian rulers, brought a new level of stability and order to the region. Trade flourished, and goods moved across the empire with a new sense of security. The very idea of an empire, a multi-ethnic, multi-city state under a single ruler, was a Sumerian Akkadian invention. It was a new way of organizing society, and it would leave a lasting mark on the human story. However, the Akkadian Empire's power was not without its critics, and the Sumerians in the south, while outwardly compliant, harbored a sense of cultural and political resentment. The Akkadian kings often had to put down revolts in the former Sumerian heartland. These rebellions were a constant reminder that the old city-state loyalties had not completely faded. The Sumerian language, too, persisted in the temples and the scribal schools. It was seen as the language of the gods, of scholarship, and of high culture. While Akkadian was the language of the street, Sumerian was the language of the university. This created a kind of bilingual society, a coexistence of two languages that would last for centuries. Historians still argue whether the Akkadian Empire was ultimately a force for good or ill. On one hand, it brought stability and a new level of organization to the region. On the other hand, it was a conquest, a subjugation of the Sumerian people and their ancient traditions. It was a complex time, a fascinating period of history, where a new empire was built on the ashes of an old civilization, but one where the old civilization's influence was so strong that it managed to survive and even thrive in its new form. It was a testament to the resilience of a culture, a silent rebellion of the mind that would eventually outlive its conquerors and set the stage for a Sumerian revival that was still to come. The world had changed, but the Sumerians, in their own quiet way, were still very much a part of it. The Akkadian Empire, for all its power and glory, was a surprisingly short-lived affair. After the death of its founder, Sargon, and his immediate successors, the empire began to unravel. The Sumerian city-states never truly reconciled to foreign rule, constantly rebelled. And then there were new threats from the outside. The empire was under siege from all directions, from the Gutian peoples in the Zagros Mountains to the Elamites in the east. This period of decline and eventual collapse is chronicled in a remarkable Sumerian poem known as the Curse of a God. It's a fascinating document, not just because it tells the story of the end of the empire, but because it tells it from a uniquely Sumerian perspective. The poem, which was likely written during the subsequent Sumerian revival, doesn't blame the collapse on political mismanagement or military defeat. Instead, it blames it on divine retribution. According to the poem, Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson and a powerful king in his own right, had become too arrogant. He angered the god Enlil by plundering Enlil's temple in the city of Nippur, a place considered sacred to all Sumerians. In retaliation, Enlil sent the Gutian people, whom the Sumerians describe as a barbaric, uncivilized horde, to destroy the city of Akkad and bring down the empire. The poem describes the chaos that followed, with famine, disease, and lawlessness running rampant. The story is a powerful piece of propaganda, a way for the Sumerians to explain why the Akkadian Empire, which had seemed so invincible, had fallen. It was a moral lesson, a warning that even the most powerful kings could not defy the will of the gods. It was also a way to legitimize the subsequent Sumerian revival. By casting the Akkadian collapse as a divine punishment, The Sumerians could frame their own return to power as a righteous and divinely sanctioned act. It's a brilliant example of how history in the ancient world was often a tool for political and religious purposes. Historians still argue whether the Gutians were really the cause of the empire's collapse or just one of many factors. It's more likely that the empire was already weakened by internal strife, climate change, and economic problems. But to the Sumerians, the Gutians were a convenient and terrifying symbol of divine anger. They were described in the poem in the most unflattering terms as a people who know no taboos and who have the instincts of dogs and the minds of monkeys. The poem painted a picture of a dark age, a period of chaos and barbarism that had swept away the glory of the Akkadian Empire. The fall of Akkad was a watershed moment in Mesopotamian history. It marked the end of the first great empire and the beginning of a period of fragmentation and chaos. The old Sumerian city-states, now free from Akkadian rule, reasserted their independence. But they were now living in a world that had been fundamentally changed by the idea of empire. The memory of a unified land, of a single ruler, would linger, and it would inspire a new generation of Sumerian kings to attempt to rebuild that glorious past, to create a new golden age. The curse of a god was a mournful lament for a lost past and a hopeful promise for a future yet to come, a future in which the Sumerians would once again be masters of their own destiny. It was a story told in the quiet halls of the scribal schools, a whispered hope that was waiting to become a reality. As the Akkadian Empire crumbled, a new, dark age descended upon Mesopotamia. The Sumerians called it the era of the Gutian invasion, a period of chaos and fragmentation that lasted for about a century. The Gutians, those rough and tumble people from the Zagros Mountains, had swept down and, according to the Sumerian lamentations, brought a period of political instability and cultural decay. The Sumerian city-states were no longer united. They were once again independent, but they were also under the thumb of these new, foreign rulers. The Gutians were not city builders or bureaucrats. They were, in the words of a Sumerian scribe, the fangs of the mountain. They didn't seem to have a sophisticated administrative system. They didn't build monumental ziggurats or write legal codes. They just kind of reigned, collecting tribute and leaving the Sumerians to their own devices, which was both a blessing and a curse. The Sumerian city-states, now free from the centralized control of Akkad, were able to regain some of their old independence. Cities like Ur, Uruk, and Lagash began to flourish again, but it was a fragile prosperity. The Gutians were a constant threat, and the internal rivalries between the city-states never truly went away. This period is often seen as a historical low point, a time when the great Sumerian civilization was in a state of arrested development, but it was also a time of quiet resilience. While the Gutians may have been the political masters, the Sumerian culture, language, and religion continued to thrive. The scribal schools, remember those? They kept going. The hymns to the gods were still sung. The traditions were still passed down. It was a kind of cultural hibernation, a way of keeping the flame of civilization burning until the political situation improved. One of the most remarkable figures of this period was a king named Gudea, the ruler of the city of Lagash. He was not a conqueror or a military genius. He was a pious, scholarly king who spent his reign rebuilding temples and commissioning statues of himself, always with his hands clasped in prayer. His statues, many of which have been found and are now in museums around the world, are a fascinating contrast to the heroic, muscular depictions of the Akkadian kings. Gudea is shown as a humble servant of the gods, a builder and a priest. His reign was a time of peace and prosperity in Lagash, a kind of oasis in the chaos of the Gutian era. His inscriptions, which are lengthy and detailed, tell us a lot about the daily life of a Sumerian city-state at this time. They talk about the gods, the rebuilding of temples, and the importance of trade. He even managed to get precious materials from far-flung lands, a testament to the enduring power of the Sumerian trade networks. Even in this dark age, the Gutian era came to an end with a rebellion led by a Sumerian king named Uttu Hengal of Uruk. He managed to rally the Sumerian city-states and, in a dramatic campaign, drove the Gutians out of Mesopotamia. His victory was seen as a liberation, a moment when the Sumerians, who had been under the thumb of the Akkadians and the Gutians for over a century, finally took back control of their own destiny. This victory ushered in a new era, a period of renewed Sumerian power and cultural brilliance that historians call the Sumerian Renaissance or the Third Dynasty of Ur. The Gutian period, for all its strife and chaos, was not a total loss. It was a time of survival, a test of the resilience of Sumerian culture. The Sumerian people, their traditions, and their language had survived a period of foreign rule and political fragmentation. They had held on to the core of their identity. And now, with the Gutians gone, they were ready to emerge from the shadows and reclaim their place as the undisputed masters of Mesopotamia. The stage was set for a new golden age, one that would see the last great flourishing of Sumerian civilization. With the Gutians finally driven out, a new era dawned for the Sumerians, a time of renewed power, prosperity, and cultural revival. This period, known as the Sumerian Renaissance or the Third Dynasty of Ur, was a final, glorious chapter for this ancient civilization. The king who led this charge was Ur-Nammu, a brilliant military strategist and administrator who seized control of the major Sumerian city-states and for the first time since Sargon united Mesopotamia under a single Sumerian-speaking ruler. He was the founder of the Third Dynasty of Ur, and his reign marked the beginning of a golden age that would last for a little over a century. Ur-Nammu was a different kind of king. He was not just a warrior. He was a lawgiver and a builder. His focus was on re-establishing order and creating a stable, prosperous society. He commissioned the construction of massive public works, including canals and temples. But his most lasting legacy was his legal code. This wasn't the famous Code of Hammurabi, which came much later, but the Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the earliest known legal codes in the world. This code was a significant departure from the brutal eye for an eye mentality that would come later. It focused on monetary compensation for damages rather than physical punishment. For example, if a man broke another man's bone, he would have to pay a set amount of silver, rather than having his own bone broken in return. This was a remarkably advanced and humane legal system for its time, and it speaks to Ur-Nammu's vision for a just and ordered society. The third dynasty of Ur was an era of unprecedented centralization. The kings of Ur established a highly efficient, bureaucratic state that controlled everything from the economy to the religion. The state owned and operated vast farms and ranches, and it employed a large number of people in the public works projects and manufacturing. The famous scribal schools, the Aduba, flourished under this new regime. They were the training grounds for the next generation of bureaucrats and administrators, the people who would run this massive, centralized government. It was an administration built on the foundation of the Sumerians' greatest invention, writing. The number of cuneiform tablets from this period is staggering, and they give us a detailed look into every aspect of life, from legal contracts to royal decrees to simple administrative lists. This era was also a time of great architectural ambition. Ur-Nammu began the construction of the great ziggurat of Ur, a monumental structure that was a physical symbol of the dynasty's power and piety. It was a visible declaration to the world that the Sumerians were back, and they were more powerful than ever. The ziggurat was a testament to the fact that Ur-Nammu and his successors were not just kings. They were the chosen representatives of the gods on earth. This new dynasty saw itself as a continuation of the great Sumerian past, but it was also a new kind of state, a highly centralized and bureaucratic empire that was a far cry from the old, independent city-states. Historians still argue whether this Sumerian Renaissance was a true return to a golden age or a kind of final, desperate gasp of a dying civilization. The period was brief, and it was followed by a new series of invasions and political upheavals. But for a little over 100 years, the Sumerians were once again the masters of Mesopotamia. They rebuilt their temples, wrote new laws, and created a society that was the envy of the ancient world. It was a brilliant but fleeting final act, a last hurrah for a people who had invented civilization, and now, for the last time, had a chance to enjoy the fruits of their labors. It was a time of glory, a brief moment of peace and prosperity before the next great storm. One of the most remarkable achievements of the Sumerian Renaissance under the third dynasty of Ur was the creation of a sophisticated legal system. While later codes, like the famous Code of Hammurabi, would be more widely known, the Code of Ur-Nammu stands as a testament to the Sumerians' advanced understanding of justice and social order. This code, written on clay tablets, was a comprehensive document that covered everything from criminal law to family matters. It was a conscious effort by the state to create a fair and predictable legal system, a stark contrast to the old tribal justice, where the verdict was often decided by the strongest party. The Code of Ur-Nammu was groundbreaking in its use of monetary compensation for crimes. Instead of the eye for an eye philosophy, it established a system where a person who caused injury would have to pay a fine. For example, if a man broke another man's bone, the punishment was not to have his own bone broken. The guilty party had to pay a certain amount of silver. This system was not just more humane, it was also more practical. It allowed for the resolution of disputes without a constant cycle of violence and revenge. It put a price on the damage done, which was a very modern and pragmatic approach to justice. It shows a society that was less concerned with public humiliation and more concerned with economic fairness and social stability. The code also covered a wide range of other issues. It had laws about marriage, divorce, and inheritance, all designed to protect the family unit and ensure the smooth transfer of property. It had laws about agriculture, with strict penalties for damaging a neighbor's field or stealing a cow. It even had laws about contracts and loans, which were essential for a complex urban society with a thriving economy. The laws were not just a list of prohibitions. They were a blueprint for a functioning society, a guide for how people should interact with each other in a fair and equitable way. This was a massive step forward from a world governed by custom and a king's arbitrary whim. Historians still argue about the exact purpose of the Code of Urnamu. Was it a truly enforced legal code, or was it a form of royal propaganda, a way for Urnamu to show his people that he was a just and righteous ruler? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The code was certainly a symbol of royal authority, a physical manifestation of the king's role as the chief lawgiver, but it also likely served as a foundation for legal practice, a set of principles that judges could use to make their decisions. It was a step toward the rule of law, the idea that everyone, from the king to the farmer, was subject to the same set of rules. The Code of Urnamu, along with the earlier codes from cities like Lagash, showed a civilization that had moved beyond simple subsistence and into the realm of complex social organization. They were not just building cities and temples, they were building a framework for human interaction. They were creating a society that was not just powerful, but also just. It's a powerful reminder that the Sumerians' genius wasn't just in their inventions, but also in their ability to create a society with a sense of order, fairness, and morality. The Code of Urnamu was a quiet, unassuming triumph, a series of wedge-shaped marks on a clay tablet that would lay the foundation for legal systems for thousands of years to come. And if the Code of Urnamu was a quiet triumph, the great ziggurat of Ur was anything but. It was a loud physical declaration of power and piety, a massive monument that dominated the skyline of the city. Urnamu, who founded the third dynasty of Ur, began its construction, and his son, Shulgi, finished it. The ziggurat was a huge terraced structure, built in 3 layers with a temple on top. It was constructed with a core of mud brick and an outer layer of fired brick, a testament to the Sumerians' mastery of building materials. The entire structure was a monumental undertaking, requiring thousands of laborers and an immense amount of resources. The sheer scale of it would have been breathtaking. The ziggurat was not just a pile of bricks. It was a symbolic representation of the cosmic order. The 3 layers represented the heavens, the earth, and the underworld, with the temple on top serving as a link between the divine and the human world. It was dedicated to the moon god Nana, the patron deity of Ur. The temple on the top, which was a sort of sacred, private space for the priests, was where rituals were performed to honor the god and to ensure the city's continued prosperity. It was believed that the god would descend from the heavens to rest in this temple, a belief that gave the ziggurat a profound religious significance. It was the physical heart of the city's spiritual life, a place where the king and the people could interact with the divine. The construction of the ziggurat was a way for Ur-Nammu to legitimize his rule. By building such a massive temple, he was showing that he was the god's chosen representative on earth. It was a powerful piece of propaganda, a way of saying, I have the gods on my side, and they have given me the power to rule you. But it was also more than that. It was a project that brought the city together. It required a massive mobilization of labor and resources, and it was a source of great civic pride. To work on the ziggurat was to work for your city, your king, and your god. It was a unifying project, a physical manifestation of the Sumerian Renaissance's vision of a powerful, pious, and prosperous state. Historians still argue about the exact methods used to build the ziggurat. How did they lift all those bricks? Was there a ramp system? How did they manage the sheer logistics of it all? We don't have a clear answer, but we do know that the Sumerians were masters of engineering and organization. They had a complex system for managing the labor force, and they had a deep understanding of architecture and geometry. The ziggurat, which stands to this day, is a testament to their genius. It's a reminder that even without modern technology, a people with a clear vision and a powerful belief system can build something that will last for thousands of years. The ziggurat was a symbol of the third dynasty of Ur's power and piety. It was a last glorious testament to the greatness of Sumerian civilization. It was a visible declaration to the world that the Sumerians were back, and they were more powerful than ever. It was a brief but brilliant moment of glory, a final flourish before the tides of history turned once again. The great ziggurat of Ur is a powerful reminder that even in a world of constant change and upheaval, some things are built to last, and a legacy can be carved in stone, or, in this case, in brick. The golden age of the third dynasty of Ur, for all its glory, was not meant to last. It was a brief, brilliant final chapter for the Sumerian civilization. But the forces that had brought down the Akkadian Empire were still at play. The end of this dynasty, known as the fall of Ur III, was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, painful decline brought on by a combination of political, economic, and environmental factors. The kingdom, which had been so centralized and efficient under Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi, began to unravel under their successors. The most significant problem was a growing number of external threats. The Amorites, a nomadic people from the west, began to infiltrate Mesopotamia in ever-increasing numbers. The kings of Ur tried to contain them by building a massive, fortified wall, much like a scaled-down version of the Great Wall of China. But it was a futile effort. The Amorites were not an organized army that could be defeated in a single battle. They were a constant, pervasive force, slowly eroding the kingdom's borders and destabilizing the region. They settled in the land, and over time, they would come to dominate it. On top of the external threats, there were internal problems. The highly centralized bureaucracy, which had been so effective in the early days of the dynasty, became a burden. It was rigid and inflexible, unable to adapt to the changing economic and political realities. The city-states, which had been so efficiently controlled by Ur, began to assert their independence once again. A governor of the city of Isin, a man named Ishbi-Era, used a famine to his advantage. He convinced the king to let him go and secure grain for the starving people. And in doing so, he gained power and influence. When the king asked him to return, he refused, declaring his independence and setting up a rival kingdom. It was a classic case of a powerful subordinate seizing power in a time of crisis. The final blow came from the east. The Elamites, an ancient rival of the Sumerians from what is now Iran, launched a series of devastating invasions. They sacked the city of Ur, destroyed its temples, and carried off its king, Ibisin, into captivity. It was a moment of utter humiliation and a symbolic end to the Sumerian Renaissance. A powerful lament, known as the Lamentation over the Destruction of Ur, was composed to commemorate the event. It is a heartbreaking piece of literature, a mournful song that describes the desolation of the city and the suffering of its people. It's a powerful reminder that history is not just about kings and battles. It's about the very human experience of loss and grief. Historians still argue about the exact sequence of events that led to the fall of Ur III. Was it the Amorites, the Elamites, or internal strife? The truth is likely a combination of all three. The kingdom was a house of cards, weakened by a slow, steady erosion of its power and legitimacy. The final blow from the Elamites was just the thing that brought it all crashing down. The fall of Ur III was a final, tragic end for the Sumerian civilization as a political entity. The great cities would continue to exist, but they would now be ruled by a new set of masters, the Amorites, who would build their own kingdoms on the foundation of the Sumerian past. The Sumerian language and culture would persist in the temples and scribal schools, but the political power of the Sumerians was gone forever. Their final golden age had come and gone, and a new chapter in the history of Mesopotamia was about to begin. With the fall of the third dynasty of Ur, the Sumerian political stage was once again fractured. The centralized bureaucratic empire that Ur-Nammu had so painstakingly built crumbled, and a new period of fragmentation began. This era, known as the Isin-Lhasa period, was characterized by a power vacuum that was quickly filled by new players. The Sumerians, for the first time in their history, were no longer the dominant political force. Their cities were now ruled by a new group of people, the Amorites. The Amorites were a Semitic-speaking people who had been migrating into Mesopotamia for centuries, and they had adopted a lot of Sumerian culture. But they were not Sumerians. They were a new, dynamic, and often rivalrous group of rulers. Two of the most important Amorite-led city-states that emerged during this period were Isin and Lhasa. The city of Isin was founded by Ishbi-Erra. Remember that guy? The cunning official who had declared his independence from the last king of Ur. He saw himself as the true successor to the Sumerian throne and ruled over a kingdom that included the sacred city of Nippur. Meanwhile, the city of Larsa, under its own Amorite kings, began to grow in power and influence. For a little over a century, these two cities and their allied city-states would vie for control of Mesopotamia, a kind of ancient Game of Thrones played out on the fertile plains. The period was marked by a constant series of wars, shifting alliances, and political maneuvering. While the political landscape was chaotic, the cultural legacy of the Sumerians was still very much alive. The Amorite kings of Isin and Lhasa saw themselves as the heirs of Sumerian civilization. They continued to use Sumerian as the language of the temples and the scribal schools. They built ziggurats and wrote legal codes in the Sumerian tradition. The great epic poems, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, were still copied and studied. This was a fascinating paradox. The Sumerian civilization as a political force was gone, but their cultural influence was more widespread than ever. It was a kind of post-mortem legacy, a silent, powerful influence that shaped the lives of their conquerors. The Eisenlasa period was also a time of great literary output. A lot of the Sumerian hymns, laments, and epic poems that we have today were copied and preserved by the scribes of this era. They saw themselves as the guardians of a great cultural tradition, and they worked tirelessly to ensure that it would not be forgotten. This is one of the reasons we know so much about the Sumerians. The people who came after them, the Akkadians and the Amorites, recognized the value of their culture and kept it alive for centuries. It's a powerful reminder that culture can outlive a political state. It can be passed down, adapted, and preserved, even when the people who created it are no longer in power. The constant conflict between Isin and Larsa eventually gave way to a new hegemonic power. Neither city could truly defeat the other, and the constant warfare weakened both. The stage was set for a new kind of ruler, a man who would unite all of Mesopotamia under his rule and create a new empire that would eclipse all the ones that had come before. The Isin-Lhasa period was a brief, chaotic interlude, a final act in a long play of Sumerian decline. It was a time of transition, a moment when the old ways were fading and a new, more powerful force was gathering in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. And strike it would, in the form of a king named Hammurabi. And then came Hammurabi. He wasn't Sumerian. He was a king of Babylon, an Amorite-led city-state that had been, for the most part, a minor player during the Isin-Lhasa period. But Hammurabi was a different kind of ruler. He was a master of diplomacy and a brilliant military strategist. He played the rival city-states against each other, forming alliances when it suited him, and then breaking them when the time was right. Over a period of about 30 years, he systematically conquered all of Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf to the city of Mari in the north. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a unifier. He brought an end to the chaotic Isin-Lhasa period and created a new empire, the Babylonian Empire, that would become the dominant power in the Near East for centuries. With Hammurabi, the last vestiges of Sumerian political power were gone for good. The great Sumerian cities of Ur and Uruk were now part of a Babylonian empire, and their kings were now subjects of the king of Babylon. But, just as the Akkadians had done before them, the Babylonians didn't just wipe out the Sumerian culture, they adopted it. They took the Sumerian scribal traditions, the legal precedents, and the epic literature, and made it their own. The Babylonian scribes were steeped in Sumerian learning. They studied the Sumerian language, even though it was no longer spoken, as a kind of classical language, the Latin of the ancient Near East. They copied the old Sumerian myths and epic poems, and they used the Sumerian cuneiform script to write their own language. Hammurabi himself was a great admirer of Sumerian culture. He saw himself as the heir to a long tradition of Mesopotamian kingship that stretched all the way back to the mythical kings of Uruk. He even dedicated his famous legal code to the gods. in the same way that the code of Ur-Nammu was. He was, in effect, a new kind of ruler, a Babylonian king who ruled with a deep respect for the Sumerian past. This cultural fusion was so complete that it's often difficult for archaeologists to tell the difference between a late Sumerian text and an early Babylonian one. The Babylonians used the same symbols, the same literary traditions, and often the same stories. The rise of Babylon under Hammurabi marked a final, permanent shift in the history of Mesopotamia. The center of power moved from the old Sumerian cities of the south to the new city of Babylon in the north. The Amorites had won the political game, but in a strange and beautiful twist of history, the Sumerians had won the cultural one. Their innovations, from writing and law to literature and city building, had become the foundation for a new, powerful empire. The Babylonians were, in many ways, the intellectual and cultural children of the Sumerians. It's a powerful reminder that political power is fleeting, but a cultural legacy can be eternal. The Sumerians, in a sense, conquered their conquerors. The reign of Hammurabi, with its military victories and political consolidation, was the end of the line for Sumerian political independence. The cities that had given birth to civilization would now exist as parts of a larger empire. But the final chapter of the Sumerian story wasn't one of defeat. It was one of assimilation, a quiet, powerful influence that would shape the history of the ancient world for centuries to come. The Sumerians' greatest legacy was not a king or a city. It was the culture they created, a culture that would live on in the libraries of Babylon and beyond. When we talk about ancient law, one name reigns supreme: Hammurabi. His Code of Hammurabi is the most famous legal code from the ancient world. It was inscribed on a 7-foot-tall black diorite stele, and a copy of it, now in the Louvre in Paris, has given us an incredible window into Babylonian society and law. The code, written in Akkadian cuneiform, is a compilation of 282 laws that covered everything from property rights to criminal offenses. At the top of the stele, there is a depiction of Hammurabi receiving the laws from the god of justice, Shamash, a powerful piece of imagery that gave the code a divine legitimacy. While Hammurabi's code is often cited for its eye for an eye philosophy, it's important to understand that this was just one part of a much larger and more complex legal system. The code's philosophy was actually based on the concept of lex talionis, which means law of retaliation. The punishment was supposed to fit the crime, but it wasn't always a literal exchange. For example, if a man broke another man's bone, he would have to pay a fine. But if a man broke the bone of a slave, the punishment was less severe. The code recognized social classes and treated them differently, which is a key departure from modern ideas of justice, but was standard for the time. What's fascinating about the Code of Hammurabi is how much it owes to the Sumerian legal tradition. The Code of Ur-Nammu, which we discussed earlier, was a direct precedent. Many of Hammurabi's laws are direct copies or adaptations of earlier Sumerian laws, though his penalties were often harsher. The Sumerian legal tradition, with its focus on monetary compensation, was a profound influence on Hammurabi, even if he did add a more punitive flair. The fact that Hammurabi's code was so heavily indebted to Sumerian law shows how deeply ingrained Sumerian thought and culture were in the subsequent Babylonian civilization. The Babylonians were building a new empire, but they were doing it on a Sumerian foundation. The Code of Hammurabi was also a powerful piece of social engineering. It was not just a list of laws, it was a guide for how to live in a civilized society. It had laws about marriage, divorce, and the care of children, all designed to protect the family unit. It had laws about agriculture, with strict penalties for damaging a neighbor's field or failing to maintain a canal. It even had laws about medicine, with strict regulations for doctors and a clear set of punishments for malpractice. The code was a blueprint for a functioning, ordered society, and it was a masterpiece of legal thought for its time. Historians still debate whether the Code of Hammurabi was a truly enforced legal code or more of a set of legal principles. It's likely that it was a bit of both. It certainly served as a powerful symbol of Hammurabi's authority and his commitment to justice. But it also likely served as a foundation for the legal practice of the time, a set of guidelines that judges and legal scholars would use to make their decisions. The Code of Hammurabi is a final, powerful testament to the enduring influence of the Sumerians. Their invention of writing and their pioneering work in law would be carried on and perfected by the civilizations that followed them. Their legacy was not lost. It was transformed, adapted, and in the case of the Code of Hammurabi, immortalized in stone for all time. We've talked a lot about kings, empires, and epic heroes, but what about the average person? What was everyday life like in Sumer? It wasn't all monumental ziggurats and grand legal codes. For most people, life was a daily grind, centered around the rhythms of farming and family. The majority of the population were farmers, working the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They cultivated barley, wheat, dates, and sesame, and they raised livestock like sheep, goats, and cattle. The year was a cycle of plowing, sowing, irrigating, and harvesting, all dependent on the unpredictable generosity of the rivers. Their lives were a delicate balance, and a single bad harvest could mean starvation. But life wasn't just about work. The Sumerians had a rich social life. They lived in small, one-story houses made of mud brick. The houses were often built around a central courtyard, which provided light and air and a space for the family to gather. The streets were narrow and winding, a jumble of houses, workshops, and markets. The cities would have been a chaotic, bustling, and probably smelly place. The sounds of daily life would have been a cacophony of vendors hawking their wares, children playing, and the endless chatter of people going about their business. The heart of the city, of course, was the temple, the ziggurat, which served as a constant reminder of the god's presence. For the middle class, life was a bit more comfortable. These were the artisans, the merchants, and the scribes. The artisans were highly skilled. They made everything from pottery and textiles to metalwork and jewelry. The Sumerians were masters of metallurgy, using copper, bronze, and gold to create beautiful and functional objects. The merchants were the lifeblood of the city, bringing in raw materials from distant lands and selling the finished goods. They were the original entrepreneurs, the people who made the economy go. The scribes, as we've seen, were an elite class. They were highly educated and held a privileged position in society. Their work was essential for the functioning of the state, the temples, and the economy. They were the original nerds, and they had a good life. And then there were the women. The role of women in Sumerian society is a bit of a mystery, but we do know that they had more rights than in many later civilizations. They could own property, run businesses, and even hold positions of power, like the priestess in Hedwana. They could go to court and testify as witnesses, but their main role was still in the home, where they were responsible for raising children, cooking, and weaving. The daily life of a Sumerian woman would have been a mix of hard work and social interaction. They would have gone to the marketplace, visited with neighbors, and participated in religious festivals. For the poor and the slaves, life was a constant struggle. They lived in the humblest of homes and worked the hardest jobs. Slaves were often prisoners of war or people who had sold themselves into servitude to pay off a debt. They had very few rights and were considered the property of their owners. Their lives were a grim reality, a stark contrast to the wealth and power of the kings and priests. But even for them, there were moments of joy. There were festivals, religious ceremonies, and the simple pleasures of a good meal and a long conversation. Everyday life in Sumer was a complex tapestry, a mix of grand civilization and simple human existence. It was a world of gods and kings, but it was also a world of farmers, merchants, and families, all living their lives in the shadow of the great ziggurats. While the Sumerians are best known for inventing writing, their genius didn't stop there. They were, in fact, an engine of innovation, a civilization that gave the world a host of other essential technologies and ideas. Perhaps the most famous of these is the wheel. The Sumerians were the first to use the wheel for transportation, creating the first wheeled carts and chariots. We're talking around 3500 BCE. Before that, everything had to be carried or dragged on sleds. The invention of the wheel, simple as it seems, revolutionized trade and warfare, allowing for the transportation of goods and troops over long distances with a new level of speed and efficiency. It was a true game changer, and it's a testament to the Sumerians' practicality and their ability to solve a problem with an elegant solution. But the wheel was just the beginning. The Sumerians also pioneered large-scale irrigation. We talked about this at the beginning, remember? They built a complex network of canals, dikes, and reservoirs to control the unpredictable flow of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This wasn't just a matter of digging a few ditches. It was a massive, coordinated effort that required sophisticated engineering and a highly organized administration. This irrigation system allowed for a surplus of food, which in turn allowed for the growth of cities and the specialization of labor. It was the foundation of their entire civilization. Without it, the whole thing would have collapsed. In the field of mathematics, the Sumerians were light years ahead of their time. They developed a numerical system based on the number 60, which is still in use today. Think about it. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. All of that comes from the Sumerians. It's a sexagesimal system, which is a bit unwieldy at first, but it has some advantages. The number 60 is easily divisible by a lot of other numbers. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, which makes it very useful for calculations and for commerce. They also developed a system of positional notation, where the value of a number depended on its position, which is the basis for our own decimal system. They were the original math nerds, and their legacy is literally everywhere you look. The Sumerians were also the first to develop astronomy. They studied the stars and the planets, not just for fun, but for practical and religious reasons. They believed that the movements of the celestial bodies were a reflection of the will of the gods. They tracked the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets, and they developed a lunar calendar. Their astronomical observations were so accurate that later civilizations, like the Babylonians, built on their knowledge to create a truly sophisticated system of astrology and celestial navigation. They were, in a way, the first scientists, observing the world around them and trying to find the patterns and the rules that governed it. Finally, the Sumerians gave us the potter's wheel, which revolutionized the production of pottery. Before that, pottery had to be built up by hand, a slow and painstaking process. With the potter's wheel, a potter could create a perfectly symmetrical vessel in a fraction of the time. This innovation allowed for the mass production of pottery, which was essential for a society with a growing population and a complex economy. It's a small thing, but it's a perfect example of the Sumerian genius for practical innovation. The Sumerians weren't just a people who built great cities and wrote great poems. They were a people who looked at the world, saw a problem, and invented a solution. And in doing so, they laid the foundation for the world we live in today, for a civilization that was built on the back of writing. It's no surprise that the Sumerian school system was one of the most important institutions in the land. They called it the Edaba, which literally means tablet house. The Edaba was the place where young boys and a few girls from the wealthiest families went to learn the art of being a scribe. It was a rigorous education, a years-long process of memorization, copying, and repetition. Students would spend their days sitting on the floor, using clay tablets as notebooks and reed styluses as pens. The curriculum was tough. They would start with the basics, learning how to write the hundreds of cuneiform symbols. From there, they would move on to more complex subjects, like mathematics, literature, and law. They would copy out long lists of words, administrative documents, and even the great epic poems. The life of a student at the Aduba wasn't all fun and games. We know this because of a fascinating document known as the School Days Tablet. It's a story told from the perspective of a student who is constantly being punished for everything from having a messy uniform to not being able to recite his lesson perfectly. The tablet ends with the student's father inviting the master scribe to their home and giving him a lavish feast, a bit of ancient bribery that gets the student a better grade. It's a hilarious and deeply human look at the frustrations of a schoolboy, and it shows that the relationship between a student and a teacher hasn't changed much in thousands of years. The teachers at the Adaba were highly respected. They were the masters of knowledge, the keepers of the great Sumerian tradition. They taught everything from grammar and spelling to advanced mathematics and legal theory. Their job was not just to teach the students how to write. It was to train the next generation of administrators, bureaucrats, and priests. The scribes were the backbone of the Sumerian state, the people who kept the records, managed the economy, and wrote the laws. Without them, the whole system would have collapsed. The Adaba was, in effect, the first university, a place where knowledge was not just passed down, but also created and perfected. The scribal schools were also the keepers of the Sumerian language. As Akkadian became the language of everyday life, Sumerian became the language of the temples, the law courts, and the academic world. It was a bit like Latin in the Middle Ages. No one spoke it on the street, but it was the language of scholarship and religion. This meant that even after the Sumerian people had lost their political power, their language and their culture continued to live on in the quiet halls of the Aduba. This is one of the main reasons we have so much of their literature today. The scribes of the Babylonian and Assyrian periods saw the value of the Sumerian texts and copied them out, sometimes adding their own commentary or translations. They were, in a way, the first archaeologists, digging through the past to preserve a culture that was fading away. The Sumerian school system was a brilliant invention, a way of passing on a complex body of knowledge from one generation to the next. It was the engine that kept the Sumerian civilization running, and it was the institution that ensured its legacy would outlive its political power. It was a testament to the Sumerians' belief that knowledge was power, and that the mastery of writing was the key to a successful and prosperous life. As the centuries wore on, the Sumerian language, that beautiful and enigmatic tongue, began to fade as a spoken language. It had survived the Akkadian Empire and the Gutian invasion. But with the rise of the Amorite-led city-states and the eventual dominance of Babylon, it was gradually supplanted by Akkadian. By the time of Hammurabi, around 1750 BCE, Sumerian was no longer a living, breathing language spoken on the streets of Mesopotamia. It had become a scholarly language, a bit like Latin in the European Middle Ages. It was the language of the temple, the law, and the Aduba, but not of the marketplace or the home. The scribes, who were now primarily Akkadian speakers, still had to learn Sumerian to read the ancient texts and to perform religious rituals. The educational system was, in a sense, a bilingual one. Students would learn Akkadian to communicate and to write administrative documents, and they would learn Sumerian to access the vast body of literature and knowledge that had been created by their ancestors. This is why we have so many Sumerian texts today. The Babylonian and Assyrian scribes were obsessed with the Sumerian past. They created dictionaries, grammatical texts, and bilingual lists to help them understand the ancient language. They copied the old epic poems, hymns, and lamentations, and they often added their own translations or commentaries. They were, in effect, the first philologists, dedicated to the preservation of a dying language. The enduring influence of Sumerian is most evident in the religious texts. The Sumerian gods and goddesses, like Enlil and Inanna, were adopted by the Akkadians and the Babylonians, who often equated them with their own deities. The Sumerian myths and stories were retold and reinterpreted for a new Akkadian-speaking audience. The most famous example, of course, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was translated into Akkadian and became one of the most important works of literature in the ancient Near East. The Babylonian flood story, which we discussed earlier, was a direct retelling of a Sumerian myth. The Sumerian language, though no longer spoken, lived on in the religious consciousness of the people. It was the language of the gods, and it was used to give a sense of gravitas and tradition to the new empires. But the Sumerian language's death was a slow one. It lingered in the temples and schools for a very long time. There's even evidence that it was still being studied by scholars in the 1st century BCE, thousands of years after it had ceased to be a spoken language. It was, in some ways, an immortal language, a powerful echo from the past that was so important that it refused to die. The fact that the Babylonians and Assyrians went to such great lengths to preserve it is a testament to its profound impact. They recognized that the Sumerians had created something truly special, and they were not willing to let it be forgotten. The fading of the Sumerian language as a spoken tongue was a final, poignant act in the long story of this civilization. It marked the end of an era, a moment when the Sumerian people, as a distinct political and linguistic entity, faded into the larger tapestry of Mesopotamian history. But their language, with its strange symbols and its beautiful poetry, had already done its work. It had given the world a new way to communicate, a new way to think, and a new way to tell stories. Its final fading echo was a quiet, powerful reminder that the Sumerians' legacy was not a matter of politics or power. It was a matter of culture, and that, as we've seen, is a legacy that can last forever. For thousands of years, the Sumerians were just a whisper in the wind, a forgotten footnote in history. The ancient world knew of Babylon and Assyria, but the people who had laid the foundation for those empires had been completely lost to time. The Bible mentions the city of Ur, but no one knew what it was. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus talked about Mesopotamia, but he was completely unaware of the Sumerians. It was as if an entire civilization had simply vanished from the face of the earth. But in the 19th century, in the sands of modern-day Iraq, a new kind of hero emerged, the archaeologist, and they were about to unearth a lost world. This was the rediscovery of Sumer. The first big break came in the 1840s when a British diplomat and archaeologist, Austin Henry Layard, began excavating in what is now northern Iraq. He was looking for biblical cities like Nineveh, and he found them. But he also found massive libraries of clay tablets covered in a strange, wedge-shaped writing. He had no idea what it was, but he knew it was important. Other archaeologists, like Paul Emily Botta and Hormuzd Rassam, began to dig at sites in the south, at places like Lagash and Uruk. They were finding the same kind of tablets, and they were all speaking the same strange language. The race was on to decipher the script. A British scholar named Henry Rawlinson was working on the Behistun inscription, a massive rock relief in Iran that had the same text written in 3 different languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and a third, unknown language. Rawlinson, a brilliant linguist, managed to decipher the Old Persian, and from there, he was able to crack the third script. He realized it was a Semitic language, which he called Akkadian, and it was used to write the cuneiform script. But there was a problem. Scholars were finding tablets in the south that were also in cuneiform, but they were in a completely different language, one that had no relation to any known language on Earth. In 1869, a French-born Assyriologist named Jules Oppert proposed that this new, non-Semitic language was the language of the Sumerians. The name Sumer came from a title used by the Akkadian kings, King of Sumer and Akkad. It was a bold claim, and it was met with a lot of skepticism. But as more and more tablets were deciphered, the evidence became overwhelming. A new civilization had been found. It was the people who had invented writing, the wheel, and the city. It was the Sumerians. The rediscovery of Sumer was a monumental event in human history. It pushed the timeline of civilization back by thousands of years and gave us a new appreciation for the complexity and sophistication of the ancient world. The archaeologists, with their shovels and their tireless work, had given us a gift, a window into a world that had been completely forgotten. They showed us that history is not just a linear march forward. It's a series of peaks and valleys, a complex tapestry of rise and fall, and that even the greatest civilizations can be lost to the sands of time. The Sumerians were no longer a myth. They were real, and their story, which we had just begun to uncover, was one of the most important stories in all of human history. And so, we come to the end of our journey, a story that began in the fertile mud of a river delta and ended in a whisper of forgotten names. But the story of the Sumerians isn't just a history of a people who rose and fell. It's a story of a legacy that has had a profound and lasting impact on the world we live in today. The Sumerians may have faded from the historical record, but their innovations are everywhere. The most obvious, of course, is writing. Every time you read a book, send a text message, or write an email, you are using a technology that the Sumerians invented. Their simple wedge-shaped marks on clay tablets were the first step on a journey that led to the digital world we inhabit today. The ability to store and transmit information with perfect accuracy is perhaps the single most important innovation in human history, and we owe it all to them. But the legacy goes far beyond that. The Sumerian legacy is also in our laws. The Code of Hammurabi, which was a direct descendant of the Code of Ur-Nammu, laid the foundation for legal systems for thousands of years. The idea that there should be a written set of rules that governs a society, that there should be a system for justice and fairness, is a Sumerian idea. It's in the way we tell time. The Sumerian sexagesimal system, based on the number 60, is still embedded in our clocks and our calendars. The 60 seconds in a minute, the 60 minutes in an hour, and the 360 degrees in a circle all come from them. It's in the way we organize ourselves. The idea of a city, a complex urban center with a specialized division of labor and a centralized administration, is a Sumerian invention. The Sumerians were the first to build a true city, and they set the blueprint for every city that has been built since. Their literature, too, has had an enduring impact. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its themes of friendship, loss, and the search for meaning, is one of the oldest and most beautiful stories in the world. It's a powerful reminder that the human condition hasn't changed much in thousands of years. We still grieve for our loved ones, and we still wonder about our place in the universe. The story of the Great Flood, which was a core part of their mythology, would go on to influence countless other cultures and religions. It's a testament to the power of a good story, a narrative that can transcend time and language and continue to resonate with people for thousands of years. The Sumerians, who we knew nothing about until a little over a century ago, are now recognized as the architects of civilization. They took the first, difficult steps from a hunter-gatherer existence to a sedentary, urban life. They showed us that it was possible to live in large communities, to work together to solve problems, and to create something that would outlive the people who built it. They were not just a people who lived in the past. They were a people who helped create the present. Their genius was in their practicality, their ingenuity, and their quiet, relentless pursuit of a better way of life. They were the first to ask the big questions, the first to build the big structures, and the first to write it all down. And so, as we end the story, I invite you to think about them, about the people who, in the silence of the night, in the quiet of a field, had an idea that changed everything. The Sumerians are no longer lost to the sands of time. Their legacy is all around us, a constant, beautiful, and silent echo from a long lost world. I hope that the story of the Sumerians has helped you to drift off into a peaceful sleep. I invite you to close your eyes now and let the images of those ancient cities, those ziggurats, and those epic heroes fade into the darkness. Let the gentle whisper of the history we've explored calm your mind. Feel the weight of the past slowly lift, leaving you with nothing but the quiet hum of the universe and the rhythm of your own breath. You are safe, you are at peace, and the secrets of the ancient world are yours to keep, forever nestled in your dreams.